How's it going, folks? Welcome to another episode of Your World with Miles. I hope you all are having a great day today. I'm having a pretty good day. I've been thinking a lot lately, though, about, at least in the last few days, about the whole situation regarding tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Now, for those who don't know, a tariff is a tax on imports, right? So if a country imports into the United States and has a tariff on it, they have to pay whatever said percentage of that item's value to the U.S. government, right? So what's been proposed and what was almost implemented but just postponed for a month in the 11th hour due to a deal made between Claudia Sheinbaum, Trump, and Justin Trudeau and Trump. So there was going to be a 25% import tax on all Mexican and Canadian goods imported to the United States. Now, economists and the markets did not really react well to this. Most economists do not favor tariffs. Most believe that it would do more harm than good to the U.S. economy. Others think differently. Others believe that this would benefit U.S. industry while raising money for the government. Now, the economists believe that the value brought by that would be offset by increased costs and ultimately harm us. Now, this was all set to go into effect, but the deal that was struck between the U.S. and Mexico and the U.S. and Canada involves them reinforcing their respective borders with the United States with more security to prevent illegal migration and the smuggling of drugs. Now, so President Trump predicated this and justified this based upon the accusation that Canada and Mexico were not doing enough to stop illegal migration into the U.S. or drug smuggling. And in the case of the Mexican government, this is definitely the case. This is definitely the case. But in the case of the Canadian government, not quite as much. I know there is some illegal migration that happens to the Canadian border. I know there is some drug smuggling that happens to the Canadian border. But it's very odd to me to paint them in the same brush, with the same brush, because a very, very minuscule amount of illegal migration and drug smuggling happens through the Canadian border relative to the Mexican border. But I digress. So I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about some of the rhetoric President Trump's been using to describe this. Now, of course, there was his justification for it that he initially stated, but later he also, on Truth Social, started to talk about how we're subsidizing Mexico and Canada. And I found this way to put it a little bizarre. I understood exactly what he meant. Immediately he's referring to our trade deficit with Canada and Mexico, but that's not really the same thing as a subsidy. It really isn't. It's not what it is. Now, of course, the trade deficit being them exporting more to us than we are to them. Now, in the case of Mexico, this is most certainly the case. In the case of Canada, it's a little bit more complicated, right? We do technically also have a trade deficit with Canada, but if you factor out oil, we do not actually have a trade deficit with Canada. We actually have a surplus. Now, a lot of the U.S. oil production is located quite close to ports, such as Los Angeles or Houston, and it's more logistically sensible to export that said oil while bringing oil produced in Alberta, which their largest area is for oil production is the Alberta tar sands. It makes a little bit more logistic sense to bring the Alberta oil down to supply the western United States while exporting the oil produced in the western United States out of the ports. Because, I mean, you would have to move the Alberta oil a longer distance if you wanted to export it out. And in an environment without tariffs, well, Canadian oil has the same value as U.S. oil. It sells for the same price, right? So it's not a huge difference between the different bearers of oil, right? Obviously, there's different grades of oil, but both the U.S. and Canada generally produce pretty high-grade oil, right? So, another interesting thing that President Trump said was, I've got it here. I've got it on this note here. I wrote it out because I can't bring it up on my phone without pausing the video, without stopping the video. Now, so, first off, just to recap, basically, we have three justifications for these proposed tariffs. Now, the first being a punitive measure, essentially, for Canada and Mexico not controlling their borders well enough. The second, because we have a trade deficit and are subsidizing them, as he said. The third being just generally he has an affinity for tariffs. He even famously said that tariff is the most beautiful word in the English language, which is obviously, a tongue-in-cheek thing to say, of course, but it is indicative of his thoughts on tariffs as an economic tool. He's very pro-tariff. He is of that school of thought. Now, I wasn't going to go too big in depth with his different Truth Social posts in the matter, because he's posting a lot about it, but I got to tell you guys, I saw this one, and my head almost exploded into confetti. It was really one of the most absurd things I'd ever seen him post. And there's been plenty of wild tweets, and wild Truth Social posts over the years. In this almost a decade that President Trump's been in U.S. politics now. Or really, about a decade now. Just about. Now, there's some interesting stuff in this Truth Social post. There's definitely a lot to unpack. Now, so, I quote, "Anybody that's against tariffs, including the fake news Wall Street Journal," which the Wall Street Journal is a pretty reputable, pretty well-respected news agency. And I'm not talking well-respected in, a CBS, NBC, CNN sort of way. Your typical mainstream media, as they say. No, it's not fake, respected. It's not that they claim to be respected, but people don't really respect them. Actually, people really do view the Wall Street Journal with a good degree of prestige. It's actually one of the only newspapers that's still doing well these days. So, anyway, anybody against tariffs, including the fake news Wall Street Journal and hedge funds, is only against them because these people or entities are controlled by China or foreign or domestic companies, or other foreign or domestic companies. So that's right, folks. Anybody who is against tariffs, you're controlled by China or the corporations. Now, anybody that loves and believes in the United States is in favor of tariffs. Guys, how can you make a statement like that? Anybody who disagrees with you on economic policy in regards to tariffs doesn't like America, and they're in league with China, or they're corporate sellouts. And anybody who loves America is, of course, for tariffs. How ridiculous. What a thing to say. Yeah, so that blew, hearing that one or reading that one just blew my mind. I was like, dude, what? Man. So look, they should have never ended in favor of the income tax system in 1913. Well, that's an interesting statement, because actually back in the day, this is actually true, the government used to actually be primarily funded by tariffs. Only in 1913, the income tax was established, and that replaced tariffs as the primary method or mechanism for funding the government. So I'm not sure here if he's just simply expressing regret that we didn't keep going with that, or this is kind of an implication that we should go back to that. Now, if we were to go back to that, it would have to be analyzed whether that's feasible, because, the situation the United States is in, the world, everything, things are much different. It's not 1913 anymore. It's 2025. Things are quite different than they were back then. So I don't know. if it's possible to raise enough money for the government like that, and the savings people would receive by not having to pay income tax would outweigh the increase in prices due to tariffs, I suppose it wouldn't be the worst idea in the world, but it would certainly be the most radical, upheaval of the tax system, the existing tax system that's been done in generations. So it'd be the biggest change in generations, by far. By far. And now, so he ended this post by the response to tariffs has been fantastic. Now, I mean, that really depends on what he means by fantastic, right? Or what response he's referring to. Now, is that the response of Mexico and Canada making a deal to protect their borders, or to protect essentially our border, basically? Well, in that case, yes, because he threatened the tariff, and they agreed to do something for us. So in that case, in that sense, you got to hand it to him. The response has been fantastic in that way. But if he's talking about the public reaction, it's been a mixed bag. If he's talking about the reaction from economists, then it most certainly is not fantastic. If he's talking about the reaction from the markets, not fantastic either. Now, just today, the market was down over 1%, which is a pretty good amount to go down in one day. It's not unheard of, but not even close to unheard of. But the market has not been reacting well to this news, or to the idea of having reinvigorated trade barriers with our two neighbors, including Mexico, which is our largest trading partner, and Canada, which is up there as well. So, what stood out to me is the sheer arrogance of the statement that, you're against tariffs. That means you're controlled by China, or you're controlled. And if you love America, you love tariffs. It's a very, you're with me or against me sort of statement. It's a very arrogant thing to say. And it never really ceases to amaze me. I mean, some of the things that comes out of that guy's mouth. I mean, it's just bewildering. Imagine anyone else saying something like that. Just imagine. Really wild stuff. So look, he should really get off the phone. He should really maybe be a little bit more humble, but he won't. He won't, we know. If he hasn't gotten off the phone already, if he hasn't tempered down his arrogance already, he won't. But, I got to hand it to the guy. He got some good stuff, the negotiation with Canada and Mexico. Now, and that segues into the question, what exactly was the intention behind announcing these tariffs? Now, was it simply to threaten them into giving us something? Well, if that was the whole goal, then hey, I mean, mission accomplished, right? I mean, and he only has postponed them for 1 month, so if they end up giving us something else for another month postponation, not sure if that's a word, but to postpone it another month or postpone it indefinitely, then I mean it would be a success, right? It would be a success. Now, I guess the downside is it doesn't really do any favors to the reputation of the United States. It doesn't really do any favors to the public opinion about the United States within the Canadian and Mexican public. But regardless, it would be a successful negotiation. And you got to hand it to the guy. One thing I really like about him is the man knows how to negotiate. He's the art of the deal, as they say. But the other possibility is, of course, that he was intending on doing these tariffs because he generally believes that's a good idea. That's something we should do. Tariffs are good. And he's given a lot of lip service to that statement. Obviously saying that, to be for America, you have to be for tariffs. To be against tariffs, you are against America, effectively speaking. So obviously, he does think the tariffs are a good idea. So which is why I'm inclined to think that it was a little bit of both, right? I think that he saw it as a win-win, right? So he says, okay, we'll put on tariffs. We'll do tariffs. Um, Either the tariffs will go through, that'll benefit us, or they will propose something that I want or we want enough that I'd be inclined to not put tariffs on them. I think it's something like that. I really think it's something like that. Now, I mean, so what the question is? Okay, you might be wondering, well, Miles, what do you think? What do you think? Yeah, I mean, it depends on what the intention was. I think both really. But now, imagining if these tariffs actually went through, do I think that would be a good idea? Frankly, no, not really. Now, I'm not as fully against tariffs personally as a lot of people are. I think that they do make sense in certain circumstances, right? I think that, for example, if we were talking about tariffing certain goods, right? For example, cars, I don't think would be necessarily the worst idea. We have a solid car industry here in the United States for manufacturing cars. If you have cars made in Mexico being 25% more expensive off the bat from the tariff, well, people would be more inclined to buy the cars made in the United States because relative to before, they're 25% cheaper relative to the former price of what the Mexican cars were selling. Assuming, of course, that they're passing off the cost directly to the consumer. In some cases, they kind of have to eat some of the, like a part of the tariff in order to continue selling in the market because they just can't afford to raise the prices by that much and still expect to sell anything. But I essentially have two problems with the idea of actually imposing these tariffs. Now, the first one is that it's tariff on all goods, not just some. Now, I think, economic policy is a real delicate matter. You have to be quite careful with what you're doing. And the idea of putting a 25% tariff on all goods coming from our top trading partner and one of our top trading partners, I think is kind of like trying to do surgery with a hammer. It's not precise enough. You're gonna do some collateral damage, right? Now, if they were talking, just cars or avocados, for example, we have a solid avocado industry in California. That would be one thing. But no, I don't support the idea. I don't think it's a good idea putting a flat 25% tariff on all imported goods. Because, look, there are certain goods that we just don't produce in the United States, but people want, right? A good example of this just throughout the world, it would be coffee and tea, right? It wouldn't really make sense for the United States to put tariffs on all imported coffee and tea that comes to the U.S. Not that much, not that most of that comes from Mexico, but just for argument's sake, if we don't really produce coffee and tea, and we produce some tea in Louisiana, but not a lot, not even anywhere close to enough to fill domestic demand, and I don't really think we produce any coffee at all. If we do, it's not a large amount. So people want their coffee, they want their tea. A lot of people drink that every day. A lot of people drink those two beverages every day, right? So people, regardless of if it goes up, like the price, 25%, they're still going to buy it. They're still going to buy it. You're just adding more cost to the American consumer. And Lord knows we don't need more costs. After the bout of inflation, it slowed down in the last year or two, but we had severe inflation for several years, and everyone's feeling that in their pocketbooks. I know I am. I know I've been feeling that in my pocketbook, in my wallet. But my other problem with this is that didn't we have a free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico? Wasn't that free trade agreement renegotiated and signed by President Trump? Doesn't this idea of putting a 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico violate the very agreement that President Trump signed? When you sign a piece of paper, when you sign a treaty, a deal, you're supposed to honor it. Are people in the future going to want to enter into deals with President Trump or maybe even the United States as a whole? Probably not, if they think that it's just going to be reneged upon, right? So, yeah, I don't support the idea, the actual practice of putting a 25% tariff on all Mexican and Canadian goods. Now, if it was some goods, that wouldn't be too terrible. Also, provided we didn't have a signed treaty on free trade that we'd be violating. There's some goods that come from Mexico that really should not be tariffed, right? You have a lot of, for example, salsas and hot sauces that we don't produce in the United States that are extremely popular here in the United States, right? If you've ever been in a Mexican restaurant, sit down. Most oftentimes they'll have a bottle of Tapatio, or you'll even see that at a lot of diner places, along with Cholula. Those are both imported sauces. We don't produce a direct equivalent here. Now, we have our own, hot sauces. We have Tabasco, for example, but it's fundamentally a different animal than Tapatio or Cholula. And if you're familiar with these sauces, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Chamoy would be another example of that. And there's a lot of different foodstuffs, especially, that are imported from Mexico. That it really doesn't make sense to tariff it. You're not helping, you're not protecting really any domestic industries. Sure, you're taking in money, but it's basically just a sales tax at that point, right? So that doesn't, to me, make a whole lot of sense. And I mean, yeah, folks, it could really cause some serious damage to the economy if this actually went through. It probably wouldn't be as devastating for us in the United States as it would be for Canada and Mexico. But, I mean, in theory, it could do some serious damage. In theory, it could potentially put us into recession. Potentially. Hard to say. Or certainly accelerate the next recession is going to be here. Because, I mean, there's always going to be a recession in the future. And part of the issue, too, President Trump, is that in the past, especially in his last administration, he kind of tied himself to the economic growth numbers. He tied himself to how the stock market's doing. If the stock market's going up, if we had good growth one year, gave himself a pat in the back. He congratulated himself and tried to associate himself with that. Now, that's a double-edged sword, right? If you're associated with when it goes up, if you're congratulated when everything goes up, you're also going to be blamed when everything goes down. So you have to be real careful with this sort of thing. Has to be real careful. And frankly, it's not a good idea. It isn't. If it was some goods, okay, maybe. But not all of them. Very bad idea. Bad idea. Some people argue that the free trade with Mexico and Canada should never have happened in the first place. Ross Perot famously argued that it would be a big sucking sound, sucking all the jobs across the border down to Mexico. And to an extent, he was correct. To an extent. Having said that, the free trade amongst North America has definitely benefited all three countries more than it's hurt them, but it has hurt all three countries in various ways. And so certain areas, certain regions feel that more, right? The Rust Belt feels that a lot more, right, in the U.S. Corn farmers in Mexico feel that a lot more because they can't compete with the large industrially farmed corn in the U.S. They just can't. While a lot of U.S. manufacturers can't compete with the low cost of labor in Mexico. So there is an argument that it should have never happened in the first place, the whole NAFTA agreement. And that has some validity, I suppose. But now that it has happened and it's been ongoing for a long time, the economies are deeply, deeply, deeply intertwined. And to try to cut that once it's already intertwined, it's going to have some serious, serious collateral damage. So, folks, to sum it up, what I'm hoping is that ultimately there's more negotiations that take place, and hopefully these tariffs don't end up going into effect fully, and that there's some kind of other agreement. Mexico agrees to do X, Y, or Z, and Canada agrees to do X, Y, or Z, and we can go on like before. Or at minimum, it's changed away from a tariff on all goods to a tariff on just certain ones. Cars, for example, maybe, or other elements of heavy industry. Something that could possibly benefit one of our domestic industries, but not everything. Not every item. Bad idea. Bad idea. But another thing is probably tariffs on Canadian oil, Canadian energy. Probably not a good price. Probably not a good thing. Energy prices affects the price of everything because you have to move all goods around. Better to keep a nice even flow of energy. Much better to do so. So folks,